Welcome to Against the Tide, the podcast where extraordinary social changemakers share their stories and wisdom. More than a podcast, Against the Tide is a celebration of courageous women who defy expectation to create lasting impact by daring to forge their own paths. We'll dive deep into powerful themes such as embracing discomfort for transformative change, how your past needn't determine your future, and how breaking free from societal labels unlocks your true potential. Join me, Jo Metcalfe, to hear stories of incredible women who, by swimming against the tide, prove that extraordinary things can happen. Ready to be inspired? This episode features research and coach psychologist Isabelle Fielding and Danielle Bodicoat, a statistician and social researcher. Together, Danielle and Isabelle form an incredible team, blending their skills and backgrounds to challenge norms and maximise the social impact of their work. Having collaborated with Danielle and Isabelle for several years, I've seen the transformative power of their partnership. They've played pivotal roles in projects addressing homelessness and mental health in sport, demonstrating exceptional leadership and support to drive pragmatic and systemic change. What sets Danielle and Isabelle apart is their dedication to enabling others. They lead generously, share their time and expertise to foster change through evidence-based practices. In this episode, they are also refreshingly open about their own journeys, discussing the imposter thoughts that sometimes creep in and how the diverse experiences shape their perspectives and actions. You won't want to miss this insightful discussion that promises to motivate and empower you to swim against the tide. So hi, Isabelle and Danielle. Thank you so much for joining today. We've known each other a few years now, and I feel like I'm only just really getting to know you as individuals, particularly the last 6 months or so when we've been working on some really interesting stuff together. So I'm just really excited to listen and learn more about your journey and see how it can inspire others. You've already definitely inspired me. So we'll start with going back and thinking about your early years and those that have influenced you. So Isabelle, can I come to you first, please?
Yeah, of course.
Great. So tell me about how you got into work and the work that you do now.
Well, I'm a research and coaching psychologist, and it's been a bit of a squiggly journey to get to where I am now. So I guess I started being really interested in sort of human behaviour way back when I was a teenager and was really keen to study psychology at university. So that's what I did. I had a couple of years in clinical working with patients, and then really got interested in the research side of things. So I went and did a master's. And then I spent 20 years working for the pharmaceutical industry, researching mainly neuroscience trials. So Alzheimer's, depression, we did a bit of pain and things like that. And we were looking at the kind of psychological assessment, so how people are affected by their illness, and also how interventions can help them. So I did that for 20 years, sort of worked my way through the ranks and went from working sort of directly on the kind of psychological side of the studies more into the kind of people management and team leadership. Although, of course, if you trained as a psychologist, you do tend to still use psychology and refer to it in everything that you do. And I suppose after my third child, that kind of corporate life and all the challenges that brings started to become more and more difficult, finding the balance and so on. So I left and started up my own business 5 years ago. And I consult as a researcher, independent researcher, and I also do coaching, training, development and things as well. So that's kind of a bit of a whistle-stop tour to my career.
That's brilliant, and we'll touch on some of those areas in a little while as well. So that's a great introduction. So Danielle, we share a working class background, which I didn't know initially, and I definitely knew there was something that we connected around. And you had an academic path in the end, but it was less than expected for yourself. Tell me what led you to academia.
Yeah, it's funny Isabelle saying she had a squiggly path, because that's how I describe mine as well. And it was never planned out. It was always just that next natural step that happened. So when I was at school, I was very good at maths. And we just didn't really know where to go with that. But my parents always wanted to encourage me onto the next step. But as you mentioned, nobody from my family had an academic background. Nobody had been to university. So we just sort of kept going along the next step. So we applied for the universities, and I did an undergraduate degree, enjoyed that. So then I did a master's, enjoyed that. So then I did a PhD, and kind of carried on going up into that more traditional academic route. Similar to Isabelle, I then had babies and found it didn't quite fit in with balance and everything there. So I also left, and I've been consulting as well for about 5 years as well.
Fantastic. And I think we've had collectively conversations around feeling like a square peg in a round hole and trying to find where we fit. So Isabelle, I'll come to yourself. I know we've chatted about this quite a bit. When you worked in the corporate world that you touched on there, tell us a little bit more about that and why you moved away from that as well.
Well, I think I always found it difficult to kind of bring my personality and style of interacting with people into that kind of corporate environment. And all the individuals that I worked with, generally I worked with lots of fantastic individuals, but it was more the kind of the system that was quite difficult to kind of break through. I was quite often received feedback that I was too nice as a leader, yet my teams were performing brilliantly. All my projects were on budget. My clients really enjoyed working with me. So I couldn't quite understand how being kind and compassionate and nice to people was an issue, but it seemed to be within the corporate culture. I think as well, being a parent in those kind of very high stakes, high impact kind of environments, where I was leading huge international teams. So there was always somebody on. Being a parent and being able to kind of switch off and do all of that juggle was a challenge, to say the least. And I can remember one day when I'd just come back from a half term away and I'd had a break, and I came back and there were problems within the team. And then I'd forgotten that my daughter had an inset day at her nursery. And then my son's school phoned and said that he had bikeability training, and could I take his bike up to school? And I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, I really am trying to do it all. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, I don't think I can keep doing this anymore. And that's when I decided I was going to leave and do something different.
So it sounds like there's a combination of your life and expectations around your life, but also the norms within the workplace. And what do you think was driving those sort of norms in that corporate world from your point of view?
Well, I think, it's such a tricky one, because the corporate system is, there's no denying it, set up to make money. And it was a bit of a strange kind of conflict in a way, working in an environment where you're there to help people. So we're developing medicines, developing interventions to help, people who are experiencing real challenges. But at the same time, everything needs to be efficient. It needs to be, we need to be making money all the time. So there often seem to be conflicts around that. Are we here to serve patients, or are we here to make money? And I think as well, that kind of, working in those really large organisations, there were lots of decisions that were made that weren't really people focused. They were more bottom line focused. So having been there for a long time, I saw cycles of culling workforce and then hiring again 6 months' time. And you just knew that it wasn't cost effective, because you having to spend time and money retraining people. And you just let go some really great people because you were going through a cull. So it felt like a lot of decisions were driven by kind of a spreadsheet rather than a kind of people-focused way of doing things. So I guess there were lots of frustrations with the system. And it's interesting that we as people make the systems, yet we find it so hard to kind of dismantle them and think about different ways of working that might be more people focused, more effective, and sort of more focused on the really important outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And bringing out that human element. But going back a little bit further, the influences that those around you have had on your career. Danielle, coming to yourself, is it your parents or who had that big influence on you as an individual?
So my parents are definitely up there. My dad's had his own hairdressing business since always just over 40 years. And I've seen the hours he's put in to making that work. And I've always understood that there's that kind of payoff from him putting that time into what he gets out of it as well. And my mum at the same time, she's a healthcare assistant. And so that's where, because I do health research now, that's where that kind of sowed those seeds early on. And for me, and the interest around that kind of thing. But generally just, I think being a working mum, it's all of those other working mums that I see that are doing that balance every day that I just find really inspirational. And it's not only one person, but it's lots of little things that I pick up and notice. And even just hearing people like Isabelle explain what she's been through, and it's knowing other people have had similar experiences, I find really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. And that's definitely an area that you guys have inspired me, how structured you are and how much you can deliver and how just human and normal you are, whilst juggling these high profile pieces of work and amazing things. So yeah, let's definitely acknowledge that. So you've both talked about sort of moving away from different careers for various different reasons. And different sectors, and we definitely share that in common, but you've maintained some form of sort of specialism within that. Isabelle, I'll come back to yourself. Do you think there's a sort of idea of a job for life anymore, or do you think the sort of workplace and our expectations are changing?
Such an interesting question. I do think our expectations are changing around that kind of, you go into an organisation and stay there till you retire. But there are definitely things that I've picked up along my career that I use now, so you sort of learn, I think if you're exposed to lots of different environments, you learn lots of different things. You get to experience lots of different kinds of people. I mentioned I've worked with international teams, so that's been fantastic in seeing how other people do work, and the kind of norms surrounding that. So since working for myself, everything's sort of come together into a bit of a picture, I think, of how everything kind of fits together. And I could never have known, as I embarked on my career, I could never have planned how it is, how it ended up and some of the projects that I would end up working on. But I think if you kind of can pick out the things that you learn along the way and kind of value yourself and your knowledge as you go through, it's really amazing the kind of things that you can achieve and the opportunities that open themselves up to you.
So, Danielle, coming to yourself now, you've gone on to different career pathways, interns, academia, and then freelancing. Talk me through a bit more about your decision making and that journey that you've gone on around that, please.
So, I always feel like I have to be quite careful when I talk about that I left academia, because I can only talk about my experience and not other people's, and other people seem to be able to do that juggle a lot better than I could. But in my experience, I'd found the juggle really hard, and it's interesting hearing Isabelle talk about systems, because I think that was a big part of it. So the people that I worked with in academia were fantastic. They had great ideas and they really wanted to change things for people, but the academic system isn't set up in a lot of ways to be able to kind of juggle having a home life and a successful career. So I found that balance really difficult, but at the same time it was really hard to leave, because I'd spent years building up experience and qualifications to be able to do that, and there was a very clear pathway, and I knew if I stayed I'd be safe. So taking kind of a leap of faith away from that safety was quite scary. But I think sometimes you need a big enough change that actually that feels like you just have to make that jump.
And you went into the corporate world as well. And how did your family react when you've made these big life changes?
I mean, my family are really supportive, and I wouldn't do anything that I did really if I didn't have my family around me, because actually some of the decisions I made aren't sensible decisions. They are now because you look back in hindsight and they've worked out well, but at the time they're not the most obvious decision to make. But I don't know if part of that comes from the conversation we had earlier, where my family, they don't really know what the expectation is. So they don't know kind of what the standard route is, and that I was walking away from that and quite what I was walking away from. And so some of their support might come from naivety. But I think a lot of it does come from, they just trust that I will do what I want to do. And so, yeah, I feel really lucky for that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that support must have had a huge impact on you. So what would your advice be to your younger self, if you were to go back?
Oh, what would my advice be? I think just trusting my instinct, because I knew probably quite a while before I left that it wasn't right, but it takes a while to think that through and for things to get to a position where they're really not tenable anymore and you have to make a decision. And I could probably have sped things up by at least a year or two if I'd have accepted that a bit earlier than I did. At the same time, everything's worked out really well, so it's difficult to have any regrets in that area.
So this sense, I've always had this sense that things will work out, and we often talk about that with our freelance work, don't we? Things will happen and things will come up. So you're obviously confident in your own ability, so that's fantastic. So Isabelle, a similar question to yourself. What would you tell the corporate Isabelle if you were to go back to those days?
I always love this question about what would you tell your younger self, because my younger self would not have taken advice particularly well. I love it. But I think something that my parents always instilled in me was sort of exactly what Danielle was saying, really, this sense of self-worth and this idea that confidence isn't having all the answers. Confidence is about having the belief that whatever happens, good or bad, you can figure it out and you can survive it. And, you've got support around you to work things out. So if corporate Isabelle had have listened to any advice that I gave her, I think I would have said something along those lines of, trust yourself and, be proud of who you are. You don't have to fit into a mould. Sometimes, it's good to break the mould and do something differently. I sometimes say when I talk about my corporate career that I felt like I never had a seat at the table, and going and working freelance, it feels like you can just go off and just build your own table and put the people you want around it.
Fantastic. What I love that statement. And then I know we've chatted previously around this sense of are you worthy to be around those tables, and the confidence to lean into things that might feel a bit uncomfortable. And being a psychologist, Isabelle, you've done a lot of work around imposter syndrome.
Yeah, it's so interesting, this term imposter syndrome, because it's one of those few kind of inner experiences that we call like a syndrome, as if there's something wrong with it, as if we shouldn't be feeling it. And I actually feel, that sense of discomfort that we feel when we're in different situations is really important, because normally on the other side of that is something that we really care about. We wouldn't be feeling nervous or anxious if there wasn't something at stake that we really, really cared about. So I think that imposter experience is something that we can kind of turn on its head and use and help us identify that we're in a position of growth, an area of growth, and that's okay. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. And actually, feeling uncomfortable can sometimes take us to, achievements that that feel a little bit out of reach. That's not to say that, I think sometimes as well, that feeling of discomfort, of not belonging, is to do with the coming back to systems, the system that we're a part of. So sometimes it's knowing the difference. And that's why I sometimes think that calling it that experience imposter syndrome isn't very helpful, because we need to kind of be a bit self-aware and inquire within ourselves, is this the environment that's making me feel like I don't belong? Or is it because I'm in this kind of position of growth and stepping outside of my comfort zone to do something different?
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's lots of people listening that can resonate with that. So what would your advice be around that, and how should we be thinking about it?
Well, I would give people the advice, maybe get them to reflect on, the stats that research suggests that around 80 to 90% of people experience some form of imposter thoughts within their career. So it's actually, when you look at it like that, it's a very normal, a very human experience. So I think the first thing is for people to recognise that if they do feel this kind of sense of imposterness, that they're not alone, that it's a very, very human experience that they're going through. And then I guess I would invite them to kind of reflect on what those thoughts might be telling them. I often think sort of uncomfortable emotions give us a particular signal or a sign that we can look at. We wouldn't be feeling anxious if we weren't worried about what other people might think, or we wouldn't worry if we didn't know enough, if we didn't value knowledge and sort of being good at what we do. So it's kind of questioning yourself about, what's at stake, where are those emotions coming from, and what's really important to me here.
Yeah, brilliant. I think I could chat about that all day with you. That's really interesting. Danielle, does that resonate, and has that played a part in your career? Anything you want to add?
Oh, massively. I mean, I've worked with Isabelle for a few years now. Well, since I started, so 5 years. And I've heard her talk about imposter syndrome quite a lot. And every time I have so many takeaways. And again, I could also talk to her about it all day. And for me, I think my background was a big part of why I feel like an imposter in a lot of situations. I remember even when I went to university, and it was all these people that went on skiing holidays and things like that. And I just felt so out of place because I didn't know anyone that actually went on skiing holidays in real life. And I used to try and change my accent a bit because I felt like people wouldn't want to listen to somebody from Leicester try and tell them some complicated facts. And it just took quite a while before I realised, actually, no, I know what I'm talking about and it's okay. And I think actually listening to people like Isabelle talk about it and realising that everybody feels this way, we're not all imposters. Actually, we're in the position we're in because we've earned our right to be there. And that really helps. And so I've realised there's a lot of the self-talk you do with yourself really can impact kind of how you feel every day.
Yeah, definitely. That definitely resonates with me.
I think I've realised that it's a bit of a selling point as well. Mm-hmm. Because of being a statistician, most people say they can't speak to statisticians. And I've realised that actually those parts of me are actually what people like. And so I've sort of tried to embrace those bits that make me a bit different rather than feeling like it means I don't belong there.
Yeah, fantastic. So Danielle, you talked about that it's taken you a little while to realise that you do belong, and particularly when you were at university. What changed? What helped you feel like you had that place at that table?
I think becoming a mum was a big part of it. I think when you suddenly have shifting priorities, you realise that the things that you used to think were really important and that would weigh on your mind, you just don't have the time for it anymore. So you spend less time in your head and you're able to just deliver. And I think and because I am that typical academic where I really appreciate positive feedback, and I started to actually listen to what I was hearing rather than dismissing it. I think I used to think people were just saying things to be nice, and then I started to realise that actually, no, maybe I've earned that, and maybe there's some truth in it. Yeah, I'm not sure really, but it's not an overnight solution. I think it's just one of those things that all of those little pieces build up, and you have to keep working at it as well.
Mm-hmm. And did those around you play a role in supporting that as well and helping you overcome some of that imposter thoughts?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I've got really good support from my family, and so it's feeling like you've got almost that safety net to take any risks. And then as well, I think it's the colleagues that I had. I mean, you mentioned briefly that when I left academia, I then went to go and work in a corporate environment for a year. And it's interesting listening to Isabelle, because my experience of corporate were very different, and they were overwhelmingly positive. And I had a manager there who was fantastic, and he built my confidence up a lot, just from having somebody that trusts you, I think, and puts you in those positions where you know they believe you can do something.
Again, it's that people power, isn't it? And the influence that others have on you as well. So let's move into sort of hopes for the future. So what would you like to see to enable more women to thrive, Isabelle?
Oh, good question. I think it's something that I've sort of quite often reflected on is this idea of how can we bring more of that kind of a different way of doing things, a different way of kind of leading, interacting with people that kind of leans more into, well, less of an alpha model of sort of competition and, money. And I kind of, the reason I'm perhaps choosing my words carefully is I don't want to fall into that stereotype of like, leaning on female qualities when, we're talking about leadership, because, obviously we're a pretty diverse group. But it's more, how can we look after all of the things that life entails and have really successful careers? So how can we enable more women to have more of a voice? There's some absolutely fantastic, brilliant minds out there that just aren't being accessed and used, and we're not hearing from enough because they're kind of constrained by the system. So I would love more of a kind of, a different model of working that enables more of those voices to be heard. I wish I could tell you what that would look like. I don't know, but I think it's something that we can move towards and experiment with and try out different ways of doing things.
And how do we unlock that, or how do we become allies for each other as well? Because I know having people like you that I speak to give me confidence to be able to do the things that I do. So how do we scale that?
Conversations like this are really helpful. That kind of normalization of all of the challenges that we have. I think probably back in the day, particularly when I was at the beginning of my career, we didn't really feel like we could talk about our challenges that we had as mothers, because we were trying to play the corporate game. We were trying to sort of say, that part of my life isn't going to affect anything at work, so we're going to sweep it under the carpet and not talk about it. And actually, as I've gone through my career, I've realised that the more we talk about our challenges, the more that we're able to kind of support each other and sort of really understand each other, the more we're able to kind of influence those wider systems and look at the things that need changing.
Brilliant. And Danielle, I know over the sort of time I've been working with you, you always want to have impact around your work. What would you like to see change and have impact?
So like you said, so I do research, and one of the things that I have struggled with over the years is when it feels like we're doing research for the sake of it. So either to make money in disguise, because sometimes that's what research can feel like. Sometimes it can feel like it's there to boost somebody's career, or just because somebody's really interested in something, but there isn't really a point to it. That's not all research by any means. A lot of research is fantastic. But I'd like it to be no research. I'd like absolutely everything that we do to have an impact on people's lives so that it can help them for the better in whatever way that is, if that's around health, homelessness, all these topics are really close to our hearts. And I'd really like to see change in that area. And I think a lot of that comes from really listening to the people that you want to help and making sure that the research you're doing will have real value for them so that it can have that impact and make that change.
And is there anything specifically about women in leadership around that research and impact, what you would like to see change, particularly for women?
Yeah, so I think it all sort of ties back to what Isabelle was just saying, that a lot of it comes back to actually listening to people and having these conversations. And I think the more that we have those conversations, the more we'll understand where the gaps are in what it is that people need in terms of women in leadership, but also what the possible solutions are. A lot of time, there's a lot of knowledge out there and people just don't tap into it. So the more you speak to people, the more likely we are to actually just find the solutions within that hive mind.
Brilliant. And finally, both of you, any words of advice for our listeners who may be at a crossroads, because you've talked about sort of the different paths that you've taken, and particularly in their social impact journeys that they're wanting to have?
Can I go first, Isabelle?
I'm thinking.
No pressure.
I think staying connected to your mission, the impact you want to make, I think can be so important when you're kind of navigating those crossroads and what you're going to do next. And that doesn't necessarily mean like, you know, your big lofty mission, although it might do. It's just thinking about, you know, what is really important to me in life? Is it compassion? Is it collaboration? Is it curiosity? And if you can kind of identify what those things are, you can take just very tiny steps towards them. And I think really that's how I've built my sort of the latter part of my career working for myself. It's just those small steps. It's one relationship at a time, one small project at a time that turns into a bigger project. But always keeping that kind of North Star of like, what am I here for? What do I want to do? And what really, really matters to me.
Great. Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah. So I think mine was going to tie into something quite similar, and it's around, we've already spoken about having those connections, like the kind of conversations us three have with each other, and it's making space to try and work out what those values are and what your North Star is. And one of the ways that Isabelle and I have done some of that I think has worked really well is that we co-mentored each other. And so it was an informal relationship. We'd meet, I think, once a month. We'd send hundreds of voice notes to each other in between. And it was great because it was very much careers type advice on what we were doing at the time, but also that we've got quite similar home setups. So it was also about the family stuff. We just connect on a personal level. And I think if you can find somebody where you've got that connection, it can be really helpful. And sometimes we'll help each other out with the situation. Sometimes it's just having somebody that will listen. But a lot of the time after we've spoken, I'd go away and I'd write down long lists of things that I wanted to do or ideas that I had. And it really sort of energized me and made me really focus in on what it was that I wanted to achieve rather than get caught up in the day-to-day doing that can sometimes overwhelm you, and then you end up on a path that isn't quite what you want to be on.
Fantastic. You guys have definitely inspired me, and I think getting to know you both on a deeper level, on a personal level, then absolutely helps on a work level when we're trying to tackle some big social challenges that are not easy to navigate, and we can have a bit of a laugh with that and be human around that. So thank you for all your guidance, wisdom today and always. Thanks for listening to Against the Tide. brought to you by Think for Wellbeing, the strategic consultancy for social change makers, with thanks to Louise Kavanagh at Purposeful Marketing and the team at Sticks and Glass. Subscribe to Against the Tide wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an inspiring episode.